The results of the Russian presidential election are out. Vladimir Putin has won by a landslide. This victory essentially secures him another 6-year term in office, meaning that he will serve as the Russian president until 2030. But none of this is surprising. What is surprising is just how casually Putin warned of a potential World War III during his victory speech. During his address to the press, Putin was asked whether a full-scale conflict between Russia and NATO is possible, and this is how he responded. Listen to it for yourself.
I think that anything is possible in the modern world, but I have already said this, and it is clear to everyone that this conflict between Russia and NATO will be just one step away from a full-scale World War III. I don't think anyone is interested in this.
Anything is possible. That is the Russian leader's statement. Putin categorically states, if the current hostilities between Russia and the NATO extend into an actual war, the world would be one step away from World War III. He quickly points out, no one wants such a scenario. Now, his remarks come after the French President Emmanuel Macron made his comments on the war. Macron appeared more hawkish on Russia recently. This week, he said France must ensure that Russia does not win the war. Last month, he said that the NATO could not rule out deployment of ground troops in Ukraine. Can you imagine what that would look like if the NATO puts boots on the ground to help Ukraine, to directly fight the Russian forces? Let me tell you, a full-blown catastrophe. And Putin is right. No one wants that. And this is why Allied leaders have distanced themselves from the French president's suggestion. Just to be clear, there is no consensus in the NATO about sending troops, at least at this stage. Ukraine has also not asked allies for soldiers. US President Joe Biden, in fact, has made it very clear. America will not send troops to fight in Ukraine. Finally, no Western government has scrambled to send troops, and that's because the NATO fears going to war with Russia. But the Russian president has no doubts. He says fighters from NATO states are currently present on the ground, helping Ukraine.
NATO military are present there in Ukraine. We know this. We hear French speech there and English speech. There's nothing good in this. Firstly for them, because they get killed in large numbers. But at the end of the day, it is not our choice. If someone wants to cover the internal problems of their countries with their aggressive external rhetoric, well, this is a well-known and widely used trick.
So is Putin right? Are NATO troops already on the ground in Ukraine? Well, it's a no from NATO. But truthfully, there is no way of knowing. What we do know is what the NATO leaders tell us publicly. And what they say is this: there will be no ground troops from NATO in Ukraine. In fact, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, the US President Joe Biden, the NATO Secretary General all have made this clear on multiple occasions. Still, we will not take Putin's statement lightly. He is serious. A direct conflict with the NATO could lead to a bigger, more catastrophic war. You see, for long, Putin has warned NATO against eastward expansion. In fact, Putin sent troops to Ukraine after multiple warnings to NATO. Do not attempt to expand your borders, or it will be seen as a direct threat to Moscow. But the war in Ukraine follows decades of warnings from Moscow. The current West versus Russia conflict has many reasons, but in Russia, the greatest reason for the conflict is the betrayal of the West. At the end of the Cold War, in 1989 to 1990, NATO had promised Russia it will not expand to the east. But since 1999, NATO added 16 more members. So Russia feels betrayed, but NATO's eastward expansion particularly inflamed one person in Russia. No points for guessing who that person is. It is the current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. So what does Putin's term mean for the Ukraine war? It confirms Putin's iron grip over Russia. It means Russia has survived Western sanctions. It comes at the back of Russian advances on the battlefield. It comes at a time when US-led West has become war-weary. Sure, no one wants World War III. And if they are really serious about that, then all steps should be taken to scale down the provocations and actually come to the talking table. But perhaps the most important step should be to really accept the honest truth. The truth about what started the war in the first place. India is upping the ante against China. According to media reports, it has started building a major ropeway project right next to the line of actual control in Arunachal Pradesh. Let me tell you more about the project. It is worth 522 crore rupees, that is almost $63 million. The ropeway will link the world-famous Tawang Monastery to Pangkang Tengso Lake and will take about 3 years to develop. This is where it is on a map. Both the places are very close to China and Bhutan borders. This 400-year-old monastery is the largest in India and the second largest in Asia. It lies at an altitude of 10,000 feet. It's about 2 kilometers from Tawang town. The ropeway would go up from here to the lake, which is at an elevation of 12,000 feet, about 18 kilometers away from Tawang. Now, as of now, it takes about half an hour by road from Tawang to the lake, but going by the reports, the new ropeway will reduce the ride to only 5 minutes. The project is expected to propel tourism in the region and allow the visitors to explore the beauty of Arunachal Pradesh. And not just that, it also highlights India's growing strategic dominance in the state. The project comes on the heels of what happened last week. The Indian Prime Minister, remember, visited Arunachal Pradesh to inaugurate the Sela Tunnel. The tunnel passes through the Selachar Bela Ridge in West Kameng district and is perched at an altitude of over 13,000 feet. It is now the world's longest bi-lane tunnel. It can handle the traffic of 3,000 cars and 2,000 trucks every day. Most importantly, it can facilitate year-round all-weather movement in this difficult-to-access part of India. Do you know what that really means? The tunnel will now allow Indian troops to move swiftly as well. It will allow faster deployment of weapons, soldiers and equipment to areas near the line of actual control. The ropeway and the tunnel are a part of an infrastructure boost in Arunachal Pradesh, and the government has big plans for the state. Several other projects are underway. Work has started for the Dibang multi-purpose hydropower project, which will be India's highest dam. And then there is the Trans-Arunachal Highway that runs across the entire state. Arunachal Frontier Highway, which will connect all the valleys in the state. The Indian Army is also working hard to provide last-mile connectivity to the most forward posts. You see, India is getting combat ready. And China, meanwhile, is fuming in anger. It does not like Indian activity in Arunachal Pradesh because it absurdly claims it as its own territory. You see, it's living in a parallel reality. In fact, it goes so far as to include the state in its map, claiming it as South Tibet. It has named villages and districts in Arunachal Pradesh as its own. After the Indian Prime Minister inaugurated the tunnel, it lashed out at India, saying that it strongly deplores the move. And India snapped back, saying that China's comments will not change the reality that the state of Arunachal was, is, and will always be an integral and inalienable part of India. The Dragon has responded once again, in fact. Listen in to what the Ministry of National Defense had to say.
The area of Zangnan is Chinese territory. China has never recognized the so-called Arunachal Pradesh, illegally set up by India, and firmly opposes it. We urge the Indian side to stop taking any actions that complicate the boundary issue and earnestly safeguard peace and stability in the border areas. The Chinese military will stay on alert at all times to resolutely safeguard China's national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
You see, China is warning that it is ready to fight. But seeing the current developments, so is India. Hunger, destitution, disaster, death. This is what Gaza looks like today. For 6 months, Israel has bombed this enclave, turning it into scorched earth. Yet, 6 months later, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not done. Despite international pressure, Netanyahu says Israel will go ahead with its planned ground offensive in southern Gaza's Rafah. Right now, Rafah is the one remaining safe haven in Gaza. Over 1 million Palestinians have crammed into the city bordering Egypt in order to escape Israeli bombardment. Just because it is the last standing city does not mean it's safe. Displaced civilians are sleeping rough, in tents, without food, without water, without medicine. US President Joe Biden, who has supported Israel during the war, has said an Israeli invasion of Rafah would be a red line without credible civilian protection plans in place. But despite the pressure, Netanyahu says Israel will be pushing ahead with the Rafah offensive.
No international pressure will stop us from achieving all the goals of the war, eliminating Hamas, freeing all of our hostages, and ensuring that Gaza will no longer pose a threat to Israel. In order to do that, we will operate in Rafah too.
Did you hear that? Netanyahu says no amount of international pressure will stop us. There seems to be no remorse for the suffering right now. Sure, Netanyahu says Israel will not leave civilians trapped in Rafah, but so far no plan to protect the civilians has been presented. How does he plan to save the civilians then exactly? They have repeatedly paid the price of the war between Hamas and Israel. They are the ones getting caught in the crossfire. And this is why all of Israel allies have appealed to Netanyahu, do not enter Rafah, protect the civilians. In fact, the head of the UN's World Health Organization has appealed to Israel, in the name of humanity, do not launch the assault. That's what he said. But Netanyahu is adamant. His office has approved the military's plan for an operation in Rafah, though no timeline has been given. If Israel goes ahead with the plan, where will the civilians go? Considering it is the last safe place for the civilians, what is Israel's grand evacuation plan for them? More importantly, what is Israel's plan for the next stage of the war? Where are things headed? Netanyahu has said it would be impossible to achieve the goal of destroying Hamas if Israel were to leave what he says are the group's last battalions in Rafah. According to Israeli estimates, 5,000 to 8,000 Hamas fighters are holed up there. But the real reason for Netanyahu's Rafah insistence is this. He is treading a fine line as he tries to appease his far-right coalition at home and cooperate with the US, a key ally. Already, as I mentioned earlier, the US has warned Israel not to proceed with the Rafah plan without a plan to shield the civilians. Washington has also described Israel's response to the October 7 attacks as over the top. And so Netanyahu faces mounting pressure over the high death toll in Gaza. But all that pressure and all that criticism is not deterring Israel's plans. It has shown no signs of winding down the offensive, which brings me back to the question, where else can Gazans go from here?